All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. This is Let's Talk by Ukrinform, and I'm Serzh Velychanskyi here from Kyiv, Ukraine, and we are going to spend this next couple of minutes, 20, 30, whatever minutes, together with a good friend of ours and a very interesting person, and I'm sure you will enjoy this time spent with us, watching us online. Well, first of all, we are having coffee with Jeremy Deer, Deputy Secretary General of International Federation of Journalists. Did I get it right?
You got it right.
All right, I've practiced.
First time.
I have practiced that. All right, so you may first of all, as you watch, put the likes. We want to see that you are with us, and secondly, if you have any questions while we are in a discussion, let us know. I have just introduced our guest today, and as an introduction, let's talk about what is IFJ, International Federation of Journalists.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. So the International Federation of Journalists is the organisation that brings together all the journalists, trade unions and journalists associations from all around the world. So it represents 600,000 journalists in 180 organisations in 140 different countries on every continent, and has as its main goal both enhancing the labour rights of journalists, but also the social and professional rights of journalists. So not only fighting alongside organisations for better pay and working conditions, but importantly fighting for freedom of the media, freedom of expression, against the jailing of journalists, against the suppression of independent media. And as you can imagine, in many parts of the world, including here, that's a major part of the work we do. But you can imagine in a country like Turkey at the moment, a lot of our resources are concentrated on the 100+ journalists who are in jail in Turkey at the moment following the attempted coup. Or in a country like Iraq or Syria, a lot of questions about the safety of journalists who are reporting from those countries are also occupying us. So it's a very varied brief that we have, but one that is incredibly important because proper independent journalism plays a crucial role in democracy, in democratic societies. Okay. And that's why it's so valuable and so important that we and others like us struggle to ensure that wherever we can, we protect and defend that independent journalism.
Okay. That's quite a big organization, and actually we're doing an interview from the a workshop. Can you share a little bit about the workshop and your brief message? Because you talked with the leaders of the trade union and different unions of journalists. And so actually you gave a pretty interesting message of some systematic work of how to unite and how to recruit, and why the trade union is better for journalists and for many other occupations. I would say it's better than not having one.
Yeah, I mean, today's workshop was specifically about trying to build the strength and capacity of the union to better represent journalists, and so we talked a lot about how to get better organised, how to develop that strength, how to recruit more people, the kind of messages that we want. But as I said at the outset of that, a year ago I hadn't been to Kiev. I've now been 6 times in the last year, and part of that is a reflection of the very difficult time that journalists Ukrainian journalists are facing, whether it is Ukrainian journalists in exile from annexed territories and occupied territories, or whether it is Ukrainian journalists reporting on corruption in a local region. They face many pressures, and we've worked with journalists here in order to try to find ways for them to be able both to protect themselves, but also to be able to try to push back against this increasing tendency that there has been to restrict journalism or to harass journalists. And I don't want to overstate the situation and say there is no press freedom, because that would clearly be wrong. But equally, there are some worrying signs that in some places those freedoms that journalists should enjoy are being restricted at times.
You being in your position in the international organization, you kind of look at all different areas and countries and situations, whereas us being in Ukraine with quite a difficult situation here, and we have our own issues, and the same thing, death of journalists, or the journalists that have been imprisoned illegally or detained in other countries. But now the question is, how do you go about doing this to end impunity? That's the right word, impunity. How does one or any organization can really go about fulfilling this mission, achieving the goal?
Of course, it's one of the hardest things that we will ever have to do, because you are basically seeking to change the way in which either a political or judicial system deals with cases like this. So it requires an enormous amount of pressure brought to bear on a country. That can be pressure from inside a country, but it can also be international pressure, and that's where we concentrate a lot of our efforts, using the various international forums that there are, whether it's the United Nations or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or using pressure from the European Union or bilateral pressure from countries to try to bring about investigations, proper judicial reviews of cases, and in some cases therefore prosecutions, and to try to change the culture within societies about the need for cases such as this to be properly protected. And of course that's very difficult, but there are cases around the world where, as a result of both local campaigning and international pressure, there has been somebody brought to justice for the killings. And that's why in cases like Pavlo Sheremet, for example, it is important that we keep up the pressure for a proper investigation as to what happened and who was behind the killing, and that when that is found out, that they are brought to justice. And there are many organisations, ourselves included, who continue to press at an international level those kind of cases. And if there is any prospect of there being a successful legal action in any of these cases, then we will help people to bring those cases with the expertise that we have from other areas of the world as well.
In your frequent travels, you see you visit a lot of countries outside of what you've just mentioned. Turkey, 110 or so journalists. Now Mexico, 8 journalists killed. Any other disturbing situations or hotspots on the map?
I mean, there are. China remains a serious challenge for all those people who support media freedom. There is very little media freedom available there. There are other countries where it is extremely dangerous to be a journalist. Iraq and Syria remain extremely difficult, particularly for local journalists. We tend to only hear the story when the big international journalist who goes there gets killed or gets arrested or kicked out of the country.
That's a big deal.
But for local journalists, this is a daily danger that they are facing. Those who are reporting from Mosul and places like that are very often the local journalists, poorly paid, often not with safety equipment or insurance for their family, but doing the job in order to bring the news of what is happening to the wider world. And a lot more attention needs to be paid to the role of those local journalists. But yeah, I mean, there remain throughout the world some very serious challenges to media freedom, and one that will obviously be of interest to people here is the situation in Russia, where there has been clearly a deterioration in media freedom there in the last 2 to 3 years, obviously, but even before that many people would argue as well.
Yeah. If we go another way and try to find out what is the best country to be a journalist in, an ideal.
I don't think there is an absolute ideal, but there are some countries where media freedom is much stronger than in others. The Scandinavian countries generally are rated by most people to be the best, in that they have the best laws, the laws are enforced, and that journalists work in better conditions and with better protections than people in many other countries. There is quite a number of countries in Western Europe as well where there is, at least on paper, a very significant amount of media freedom and journalism freedom. That's not to say always in practice does it work, and the unions in those countries would be able to catalogue cases where they say the rights of journalists are being breached on a regular basis, but we rarely get the killings of journalists, we rarely get the jailings of journalists, and we have been able to remove from legislation things like criminal defamation and some of the laws that really attack the right of journalists to do their job properly.
Well, a lot of countries have ways to go yet.
And I mean, when you look at it, if you looked on a piece of paper and said who's got the best policy, then some people would talk about the United States. It has on paper some of the best laws contained within its constitution about the right to freedom of expression.
Sure.
And yet we know at this very moment in practice that there are very serious concerns about attacks by the presidency on the right of journalists to do their job, or attacks by supporters of the president about others not doing their job properly. And so even though you have it on paper, it is important that the society also makes sure that it is carried out in practice.
If we go back to the basics and foundation of the journalist's occupation, right now here in Ukraine we have a lot of, like for instance, Facebook is a huge battleground for a lot of opinions, a lot of information. A lot of it is fake. A lot of it is twisted, manipulative, and perhaps you can call all of those people that create those articles or videos journalists. But some of them are doing it very, I would say, biased journalism, or a hidden agenda journalism, or whatever you call. How would you call it? And how would you identify, the real purpose for journalism? And how can you identify or is there a term, right and wrong in journalism?
Well, what I'd call it is not journalism. I mean, that's the reality. People who deliberately manipulate the news, who deliberately either by creating false stories or by deliberately omitting information that would give a different perspective on a story, are not doing journalism. Some of them may be employed by media organisations and some of them may call themselves journalists, but the work they are doing is not the work that a journalist should be doing, which is having a respect for the truth. Now, we all understand that the way in which a society reports certain views can be tailored towards that society without being untrue, and so it would be very rare for a British publication to be constantly against Britain's interests, because it is a commercial organisation that probably wouldn't survive in that environment. But there are also times when it is right to be critical of the British government, right to be critical of the way in which Britain has done something in trade or human rights. And that's the mark of good journalism, is that there is a respect for the truth and knowing when it is right to ask the difficult questions that have to be asked. And I always find it interesting when I'm here, because there is a debate to be had about patriotism and journalism. There is people who say, well, if you write something bad about the government, that's being unpatriotic. It's not. That's doing the job of a journalist. And it is more patriotic to ensure that the government is democratic and accountable and to represent the interests of the citizens of the country rather than the government and the powerful institutions of a country. And so I think in lots of countries that debate is very real and live in journalism, and it's good that they have that debate.
But here's the thing. We're talking about the morals or ethics of journalism, and I understand that on your official website of the International Federation of Journalism there is the whole section on ethics. Now, here with the situation that we've had for the past, especially several years, we've got a lot of informational. A lot of messages, a lot of video or in the form of text messages that are coming from another country or coming from some local that are then we find out that it was complete lie, but they still function. In fact, and they still have, a pass or a document that they are the press. In fact, some of them may be the members of an international federation as well. Is there anything you can do about this as an organization? Is that, and now, and I would probably back it up with another question. Or is this a mission, or for you to do anything about this, or what? You see what I'm saying? You from one side, you can't come understanding what your mission is or what your function and purpose is. You can't come and just beat on the head and you're not doing this right or this wrong. But where's the limit? How can you? How can we keep the integrity of the occupation of the what they have?
I mean, the way in which we can keep the integrity is by making sure that we keep ethics at the heart of everything that we do. Do we ever pretend that there are no unethical journalists? No, there are lots of journalists who, either because of pressure put on them, be it commercial pressure or political pressure or their own vested interests, are unethical and will deliberately mislead. Those people should not be members of the union in a country, but it is not my job to set the rules and the laws of each individual union. Indeed, if I came to Ukraine and said, well, your union should be this, should be that, should have this rule, that rule,
sure,
you would decide between yourselves what you wanted, rightly so, and it wouldn't be for me to decide. So we have a very strict rule that unions that can be members of the IFJ have to have a constitution that allows people to join of all political persuasions, that they shouldn't have a political agenda, and so on and so forth. And just recently we have rejected a whole number of unions who have within their constitution that they are supporters of such and such a political party or such and such a religious or political movement, and we simply can't accept that. Now, within those unions that fulfill our criteria, there will still be journalists who do not uphold the highest professional standards of journalism. And that's where the ethical training, the concentration on ethics in our work and our campaigning is so important. And we do that in lots of countries that don't have a good tradition of journalism. And we do it with the local unions. And the unions themselves are very often at the forefront of trying to push that, but they are doing so within a journalistic system in many countries which is under severe pressure, where they are under very heavy political pressure, and they are pushing the best they can against the boundaries that are imposed on them by the state or political institutions. And our job is to help them keep pushing those boundaries and to help keep supporting those journalists who are doing a good job, as opposed to simply supporting those journalists who are engaged in propaganda. And when there is a conflict situation, and you take the Russia annexation of Crimea situation, you are going to get enormous political pressure put on those Russian journalists to only speak about that situation in one particular way. And that's why it's important that we try and help those people in Russia and in Ukraine who are trying to tell the truth about that situation to be able to do so. And for example, just recently we have helped a journalist to publish an important story about that. I'm not going to name the journalist or anything, but we have been able to help provide the resources for a journalist to be able to do that, which would give people a different perspective on one aspect of that particular conflict. So yes, there are things we can do, but we can't wave a magic wand and change what happens in Bahrain or in the Gulf states or in an African country ruled by a dictator, or a Latin American country that has a despotic regime. Or we can't just wave the wand and stop there being the pressure on journalists to conform to a false idea of the national interest. But we can help them try to push at those boundaries, and that's what we do, whilst also educating.
As far as I remember, particularly in Africa, that some journalists, radio journalists, have faced consequences and law persecution after like many hundreds of thousands people have been killed because of their radio programs and stuff.
Yeah, in Rwanda that was the situation.
Yes.
Radio Mille Collines, or Radio Thousand Hills, as it's known. Yeah.
So they did carry the responsibility. So it's not. You can't say that you. Well, in my mind, especially if because of your messages, the war starts or killing starts and sort of things, then there's got to be some sort of responsibility over that, because
of course
it's as deadly weapon as a machine gun and the cannon.
Exactly. And I mean, in that situation, the international community acted. It wasn't us who did it. It wasn't the union in Rwanda. It was the international community took action, and the international criminal courts and everything were involved in taking action against that radio station, which was calling on people on a daily basis to take machetes and kill the cockroaches, which was the word that they used to describe the other ethnic group within Rwanda. And it was quite clear to demonstrate that they were making the appeals and people were going out on the streets and killing hundreds of people with machetes. There was a very direct link, and there was a prosecution and so on. Now, what a lot of these things, and it goes back to whether it's impunity or it's tackling this hate speech and this propaganda which is put out by a number of countries, especially when they are in conflict, is a political will on behalf of the international community to act against them. And we will constantly call for action, and we report these things to the Council of Europe's platform for freedom of expression. We make complaints when we make submissions to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. We made a report last year to them on the situation in Ukraine and Crimea as well. And yet, all too often, these institutions, for their own political interests or because they're in a political stalemate with one country vetoing action, then they don't take the necessary action. But it doesn't stop us, both as journalist unions or stop citizens making a noise about these things, because the more noise we make, the more likely they are to take some kind of political action.
Back in 2016, the journalist Roman Sushchenko, who used to work who works for Ukrinform, the Ukrainian national agency, since 2002. He was detained in Moscow while conducting, as they say, espionage activities. Now, next week, July 13, is going to be another hearing initiated by the lawyers that are not that do not agree with the decision that the court carried out, and we have several journalists there. What kind of noise should happen that we can free those people?
Well, in the event that any journalist is arrested for doing their work as a journalist, there should be lots of noise. And next week we can, along with other organisations and our affiliates, make a noise about that particular case. Of course, we don't say ever that journalists shouldn't be taken to court and face justice, but it should be for criminal activities or activities which are against the law, not for their journalism. And quite clearly, in instances like this, things like espionage or criminal behaviour are used as an excuse to stop a journalist doing their job. But in this particular case, we are more than happy, we would have done at the time, we are more than happy to try and make more noise and to target that noise at the authorities who have the power to make a decision about releasing the person.
What can the Ukrinform and other journalists, the trade union, I know, has rejected the participation with the international journalists meeting in Russia, in Moscow, because of that. And unfortunately, that was just a little, and that's it. Yes, it was a boycott of that meeting, but didn't go far. And I think things like this should keep on going and going. Now, actually, I just let's see. Let me check. I had an interesting some European Union deputies. Let's see, parliament members. Okay, no, yes, Rebecca Harms, and it's just one of the examples. If it goes on, yeah, Rebecca Harms, on the birthday of journalist Sushchenko, and on his 131st day in the Fortova, the prison, she put out the placard "Free Sushchenko." And I have seen that a lot of international figures have expressed their support, but I think but here's the thing: we're talking about at least 2 journalists, but there are over 30 people, like the famous movie maker Sentsov. He's been sentenced for 20 years now because of, again, some sort of terroristic attempt in Crimea. I think what could be the steps for us to just probably go after one at a time, all together, yes, for sure. And there are organizations that are really upholding the names and keep reminding everybody. But especially now, if we talk about Sushenka, is there anything specific or something more that can be done, or should the Ukrinform direct an official letter? Or
yeah, I mean, I think if the union here asks us to do something, we are almost certainly we will do it. As you can imagine, there are lots of cases around the world at all times, and we will be supportive of all those who are campaigning to free journalists wherever they are in prison. And so if we are asked to do something particular on a particular day, and for example, one of the things we often do in cases is we coordinate activity between affiliates in lots of different countries to target the embassy of the country which is holding the journalist in their own country. So, for example, going to the Russian embassy in Brussels and in Amsterdam and in Milan and in London and in New York and so on, so that there is both a pressure brought to bear, but there is also a raising of the profile of the case. But I mean, yes, there are things we can do, and if there is a request to do it, we will do our very best to meet that request.
We'll definitely talk with the union and see how things could be done and what could be done. Now,
and importantly as well, and one of the things we will do is ask our union in that country to also raise the issue. And it has been the case in many that the Russian Union of Journalists have raised cases about Ukrainian journalists. Sometimes they are simply given the answer that it is none of their business and they should stop talking about it. And again, it's what I'm saying, within boundaries, people try and push as much as they can. And we would also ask them to raise the issue again and see what can be done. And I have no doubt that they would try. I can't promise that they would succeed.
Well, I understand in that situation it might be dangerous, it might be threatening and stuff, but it would be interesting if, how they react. One of the issues that has been raised, and we touched a little bit on it, about the ethics of journalists. And here's the thing. They often quote at BBC ethics to stay above the conflict and give correct names of all the sides of the conflicts and stuff like that. But in my mind, I was like thinking, it's easy to follow the standards like this if you are covering a story in Africa, Syria or Ukraine. For them, it's far, and it's some sort of conflict between some sort of sides in general setting. Of course, once you get deeper, then you kind of understand more and more, but you still... So it's like for me to do a story on maybe Brazil, or something happening in Brazil. For me, one side or another, I'm so far away from there, so it's just, I can't be correct, politically correct and all that. But now, for Ukrainians, with the situation that we have some local journalists that are calling for not to call an enemy, to call an enemy another side, or not to call the Ukrainian army our boys, but to call them another side. To be so general in the covering of the conflict, and they say this is the BBC standards. I can understand the standards in a general sense, but sometimes once you get involved, especially if it has to do with your family, with your apartment, with your house, how far above the conflict you can stay?
Of course, it is more difficult to stay neutral in terms of your reporting, or at least balanced in terms of your reporting, when the conflict is on your doorstep and involves you more directly. The BBC had that problem with covering the conflict in Northern Ireland. The BBC covers the whole of the UK, including the north of Ireland. It has both Protestant and Catholic, loyalist and Republican reporters working side by side in the newsroom. And yet, during that conflict, there would have been criticism probably from both sides of the reporting, because that's generally the way in which it happens. Both sides criticise it, but it would have, to a large extent, met standards of journalistic ethics, and it would have done so by doing the kind of things that you talk about. You don't need to say the enemy, you say the British Army, the Indian Army, the Italian Army. That's factual, it's correct. It doesn't suggest any sympathy for them, it doesn't suggest any less sympathy for people who might be being bombed or tortured or whatever. But to value load the conflict undermines the journalism, because there is a perception that it is a one-sided story, that it is not balanced. Therefore, do I trust this? What information am I not being told? Because this journalist clearly has a certain perspective. And to me, it ends up being self-defeating. Only people who completely agree with everything you say end up reading what you say. Therefore, what's the point in writing or broadcasting that particular type of story? But it is difficult. For example, when the UK was involved in a conflict with Argentina over the Falkland Islands, although it was 5,000 miles from from the UK itself, it was British citizens who were on an island occupied by Argentinian soldiers, invaded by Argentinian soldiers. And we had two very different types of press coverage. We had newspapers, which don't have any legal obligation to be balanced, who did talk about our boys, and everything was about the heroic Brits and the dirty, horrible, smelly Argentinians, and it was very obvious. But you still then had the BBC reporting the conflict in the most balanced way that was possible. But that doesn't mean to say that there's a moral equivalence.
Yeah.
Balance doesn't say you have to say, oh, well, both sides are to blame, or both. You can still quite clearly, for example, in the Syrian conflict, you would get a quite clear perception from reading and listening to the BBC that it is the Assad regime that is to blame for the situation in Syria at the moment. And yet, the reporting isn't done in such a way as to create that impression through the terminology or the use of language or anything. It is the nature of the stories that are reported, but they are reported properly. And I mean, this is a very live debate in journalism. No journalist has exactly the right answer. The BBC isn't always right about all these things, but globally it is respected by people because they trust the information more, because they feel that there is a balance to it. And a journalist has to think about that in terms of the type of journalism that they do.
It seems like it's easier to be more balanced. The farther the war away from your home, the more balanced you can be.
That is human nature, I think. You are much more likely to feel strongly about something that directly affects you or your family than you are about a conflict, no matter how horrible that conflict might be, that's further from your doorstep. Does that mean that you should lose all your objectivity? Does that mean you should stop telling the truth? Does that mean that you should label people in one particular way? Is that doing anything to get to the root of the causes of the conflict and how we solve the conflict? Well, I would argue no, but I also understand it is hard to say, well, this is happening just over there with all my family involved, but I'm going to be holier than thou, and it's not easy, but it is important that we ask ourselves the question, are we telling the truth, and is the journalism that we're doing adding to the conflict, or is it helping to explain the conflict to citizens, which is ultimately our job?
Yeah,
I know you and I have had this discussion before, and it is a difficult one, because I'm talking in a theoretical way, and you're talking as a journalist who's having to deal with it day to day, and they're different things, and I can't say, oh, you're doing it all wrong.
And the thing is that our journalists have faced this situation and have gained such a brand new experience, and are still gaining, because one of the things you can hear more and more, that during the war the journalists should become propagandic. And I'm thinking, in a sense, it's easier to be a pacifist if, for instance, in the United States, when there were, in the 60s, a lot of pacifistic movement against sending the troops to Vietnam. And in a sense, it's easier to be pacifistic in that sense when troops are going elsewhere, somewhere in the world. They should have probably tried to be pacifistic if they were attacked, and it's not that then the pacifistic movement, or even the feeling, becomes what's the word, a traitor-like movement, something that because if you're attacked and then people say stop the war, you're kind of like, okay, so if I stop, so what? Well, I didn't attack anybody.
But why are we talking about the pacifist movement? Because a journalist shouldn't be saying stop the war.
Yeah.
Either they shouldn't be saying start the war.
Yeah.
They should be saying, why is the war starting? What are the arguments about territory or peoples or ethnicity, and should explain the arguments that people are putting forward, whether it is to fight more war or whether it is to come to a peace agreement. It is not the job of the journalist to be the mouthpiece for the politician. It is the job of the journalist to explain what the politicians are saying, and for citizens to make decisions. That politician is right, that politician is wrong, that country is wrong, this country is right, these people are under occupation, this is the occupying force. And you can do that by presenting facts to people, not by calling somebody a name. It doesn't. I don't understand myself how that helps.
That's an emotional imperfection, maybe per se. You would say. I would call it, because then you once you're emotionally overwhelmed, then you use some of the terms.
But this idea of traitor is really interesting as well, because you take a hypothetical situation where a country is at war, but it is carrying out human rights abuses against prisoners of war. Is it patriotic or traitorous for a journalist to report that that they are executing prisoners in a prison?
Well, that would definitely be the job of a journalist, but then his personal decision on whether or not to do that. But as far as the mission and calling of a journalist, that would probably be the case. You need to reveal all the injustice that takes place, and if people suffer or human rights violated. That is definitely true.
And that's where I would argue that journalist is being patriotic, not a traitor.
Sure.
Even though it might not be in the immediate best interest of fighting that particular war, it is in the best interest of the society to hold its governments and its leaders to account.
But the thing with the abuse, there's always abuse which should be dealt with in the war situations. But what I'm saying is that there's definitely, you have to, especially if there is a conflict between, let me say, two different flags, okay? You have to identify still under which flag you're writing. If you are one of those two, what I'm saying, if you're from across the world, you are, you're kind of doing the story as much as you can. But once you're in this situation, do you understand what I'm saying?
Well,
not really.
Well, I do, but I disagree.
Okay.
I mean, you can be a Ukrainian journalist working for Ukrainian media and writing a story that is factual and correct. Why do you have to pin a flag to yourself? Because then, my first idea, if you are sporting a great big flag while you report, my first idea, if I know nothing about you, is to think, okay, so he's speaking for that side. Not that he's telling me the truth about the conflict, but that he's speaking for a particular side. And I think that's the danger when media become propagandistic, then only those who already believe them. And
but if you're part of the media, like one of the journalists here, she's from Crimea. So if you're part of the country, that part of your territory has been annexed, and I would say she doesn't say "Hail to President" for all the time or whatever. But she definitely calls the occupants the occupants. She definitely calls the violations of human rights as the violations of human rights, and she keeps her identity. That her identity is in the mainland, with the capital in Kyiv. As the personal and professional identity still. So what I'm saying is, by being under the flag, it's not literally, but you still need to. There's still some side.
Yeah, and in that instance, to say occupied, I don't think there's any. I mean, it's visible. You can see
the UN documents.
Exactly.
And stuff, yes.
And so it's not that you should not use a term like occupied. It is that you should not wrongly use terms which are trying to create a certain view of the conflict, which is not true. In this instance, it is true. So why would you not use the word? You said she exposes the human rights violations. That's what every journalist should be doing, is exposing the human rights violations by all sides in the conflict. If they're only by one side in the conflict, then you only expose the ones of one side in the conflict. But the job is to dig deep and get the facts out and share the facts with citizens. Citizens are the ones who can choose what sides they take in this. And when you put down the microphone after a day of work, you might, as a citizen, have a very strong view about any situation in the country, within the world. But when you're reporting, you should be trying to give the truth and the facts. always accepting that it is very hard not to allow a certain part of yourself to come out in your journalism.
Yeah, that was quite an interesting conversation. And now, by the way, with the visa free, we could be now traveling and going to wherever you are located.
Yeah,
Brussels.
well, in Brussels, but of course I'm British, so soon we'll leave the European Union. We won't be allowed to travel anywhere. So.
Then you can apply for visa free.
Exactly. Yeah, I'll have to do that to go to Brussels. I mean, if the worst kind of Brexit happens, then I'll have to apply for a work visa as well. So
that is. So you will be even behind in line, behind Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm going to take your line.
Yeah, I'll be in that long queue.
Oh boy. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Seriously, it was a very
always fascinating
pleasure. Well, thank you, friends, for being with us. This was Let's Talk by Ukrinform. The program, the online program that's been developed in order to let you know what Ukraine is and the place of Ukraine in the world and the place of the world within Ukraine. So thank you very much. I'm Serzh Velychanskyi. Stay with us. Goodbye.